So, how do you win a Nobel Prize? Well, what if I told you it could start with something as simple as looking at fast food joints on a state line? Sounds kind of crazy, right? But that's pretty much the story of David Card. And this isn't just about an award. It's about what's known as the credibility revolution, a total game changer for how we find real, solid answers to some of society's biggest economic questions.
I mean, think about questions like these. They're huge, right? They're all over the news, they're super controversial, and they affect millions of people. For decades, economists just went back and forth debating them endlessly. And the problem wasn't that they didn't have theories. Oh, they had plenty of theories. The real issue was a lack of actual proof. Because, in the messy real world, how on earth do you prove that one thing actually causes another?
And that right there, that's the central challenge of pretty much all social science, telling the difference between correlation and causation. You've probably heard this before, right? It's the classic example. In the summer, ice cream sales go up, and so do shark attacks. The two things are correlated, but obviously one doesn't cause the other. For economics, though, this wasn't just some fun little brain teaser. It was a full-blown crisis of credibility.
Okay, so let's dial it back a bit. Picture this. It's the 1980s, and the field of economics has it has a big problem. A huge one, actually. Researchers had all these beautiful, elegant theories and super complex computer models, but when they tried to use them on real-world data to prove cause and effect, the results were just all over the map. It was a mess.
See, the old way of doing things was to build these incredibly complicated statistical machines based on whatever theory you had. But these models had a fatal flaw. I mean, there was this one famous study where they gave the models a problem where they already knew the right answer. And you know what happened? The models spit out a dozen different, totally contradictory results. It was clear the tools themselves were just broken.
And this quote here from an economist named Ed Leamer, wow, it just perfectly captures the crisis at the time. He's basically admitting out loud that economists weren't really letting data change their opinions. It sounds wild, but there was this deep-seated belief that real-world evidence was just too messy, too unreliable to be trusted. So the whole profession was kind of stuck. How do you find the truth in all that noise?
And this is where David Card comes in with his big breakthrough idea. He saw this credibility crisis and proposed a solution that was just brilliantly simple. He said, okay, instead of trying to build these perfect, sterile experiments in a lab, what if we just look for experiments that are already happening, out in the real world?
And that right there is the absolute genius of what we call a natural experiment. It's when some real-world event, like a new law, a policy change, heck, even a historical accident, naturally divides people into two groups. You get what scientists call a treatment group, the people affected by the change, and a control group, the people who aren't. And if those two groups are pretty similar to begin with, you can just compare them, and boom, you can isolate the true effect of that one change.
Okay, so that's the theory, but how does this actually work in practice? Well, Card's most famous study, which he did with his colleague Alan Kruger, used this exact idea to tackle that first massive question we talked about. Does raising the minimum wage really kill jobs? And let me tell you, their approach was just legendary.
So they went looking for a natural experiment, and they found the perfect one right on the border between New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Get this, back in 1992, New Jersey decided to raise its minimum wage, but Pennsylvania, literally right across the river, didn't. All of a sudden, a simple state line had created the perfect real-world laboratory.
The setup was really straightforward. They just surveyed a bunch of fast food restaurants on both sides of the border, both before and after the wage hike. So New Jersey was the treatment group, they got the higher wage, and Pennsylvania was the control group where nothing changed. By comparing the two, they could figure out the real effect of that wage hike.
And the result? Well, it was an absolute bombshell. For decades, like your standard Economics 101 textbook said that a higher minimum wage has to kill jobs. It was just accepted as fact. But Card and Kruger's data showed something completely different. They found zero evidence of job losses in those New Jersey fast food places. This wasn't just a new finding. It was like a direct challenge to the entire foundation of labor economics.
But Card didn't stop there. He took this same natural experiment logic and applied it to another super controversial question. What is the real economic impact of immigration? And to find his answer, he looked to a really dramatic and totally unexpected moment in history.
So, back in 1980, Fidel Castro suddenly allowed about 125,000 Cubans to leave the island. This became known as the Mariel boat lift. A huge number of them settled in Miami, and this increased the city's labor force by a staggering 7%, basically overnight. It was a huge, sudden shock to the system. And for David Card, this was another perfect natural experiment.
So how do you study something like that? Well, Miami was obviously his treatment group, but what about the control group? This is where it gets really clever. He chose 4 other American cities, think places like Atlanta and Houston, that had really similar economic and demographic trends to Miami. But, and this is the key, they didn't get that sudden wave of immigration.
And just like before, the results were stunning. They completely defied what everyone thought would happen. Despite this massive, sudden flood of new workers into the city, CARD found pretty much no negative effect on the wages or the employment rates of the less skilled workers who were already living in Miami. It was just incredibly powerful, real-world evidence that flew in the face of common fears about immigration.
So you can see how the impact of these studies went way beyond just minimum wage or immigration. When you put them together, they helped kick off this whole credibility revolution in economics. It was a fundamental shift in how people even thought about doing research with data.
What CARD's work really championed was a new design-based approach. The game wasn't about building some super complex theoretical model and then trying to make the data fit. No. Instead, the most important skill for an economist became the hunt for a clever and credible research design, finding a convincing natural experiment that could give you a clear, transparent answer.
And his new way of thinking, it just spread like wildfire. This demand for credible, causal evidence completely reshaped not just labor economics, but also how we study public policy, education, economic development, you name it. Really, the standard for what counted as proof in the social sciences was raised, and it was raised for good.
And that brings us right back to where we started this whole thing. In 2021, the Nobel Committee gave the prize to David Card for, and I'm quoting here, his empirical contributions to labor economics. It was the ultimate validation of this entire approach. It was a prize for finding these brilliant ways to let the real world speak for itself, and, maybe more importantly, having the wisdom to actually listen to what it had to say.
So that leaves us with one final thought, right? Card's work proved that some of our most deeply held common sense beliefs about how the economy works can totally crumble when you actually test them with credible evidence. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other ideas that we all just take for granted today are just waiting for their own natural experiment to come along and show us we've had it wrong all along?